Aaron, it's all yours. Thank you.
All right, Doug, thank you. You have me loud and clear, I hope?
Yes.
All right, excellent. So yes, it's very wonderful, very nice to be here and to be able to present this month's climate and drought outlook for the north central U.S. Area here. I was thinking about kind of a sub-headline to this, perhaps being tropical storms, derechos, and drought, oh my. But that would be leaving out a lot of other things that we're experiencing here across the region, from heat and wind to even a little snow in some places. And of course, some nagging issues from 2019 that are still lingering a little bit. So we have a lot to talk about today. So we'll go ahead and we'll jump into that. So as always, this is a very collaborative process. Federal, state, and local groups throughout the north central region providing this collaboration of climate services, bringing in information from different hubs, climate hubs, state climatologists across the region, of course, NOAA, Midwest and High Plains Regional Climate Centers, and the National Drought Mitigation Center. For those that are marking your calendar, our next regular climate drought outlook webinar will be July 16th, 2020, 1 p.m. Central. Martha Shulsky from the Nebraska State Climatologist will be presenting that webinar. You can always have access to these and future climate webinars at those links provided there. And as Doug mentioned, we'll be open for questions at the end, so type those in the chat or ask your questions as we get toward the end of the presentation. So pretty typical agenda here for if you've been with us in the past: climate recap and recent conditions. We'll get into some of the impacts, from hydrologic impacts to snow, a little bit of snow and water, obviously, with rivers and agricultural impacts, and maybe some major events that we've seen in the region over the last 4 weeks here. And then we'll end with our outlooks, both or short term in July, and kind of the rest of the summer updates as we start to get very close to July here on the calendar. So our recent climate conditions, we'll start with our May recap. From a temperature perspective, these are the statewide average temperature ranks here for May 2020 compared to the period of 1895 to 2020. So much like, following in April's footsteps, temperatures generally across the region were below average, near to below average for many states, from Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, westward, out to South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas as well. Not all of us were cold, but of course, if you go up North Dakota, Minnesota, and over into the Great Lakes, those statewide temperature ranks were near average for that period. And of course, the farther west you go for May, Colorado, Wyoming, for instance, these are large exceptions for the region. The 9th warmest, for instance, in Colorado there. So contrasting differences across the region, as we often experience here in the north central region of the U.S. Colder in the east compared to average, and a little bit warmer or much above average across the west. As far as our precip goes for the month of May, again, mixed bag of conditions. Much like the temperatures, we have the cooler conditions in the east went along with wetter than average across the eastern states, generally top 20 to top 30 for states like Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, over into Missouri, and up to Michigan as well. Sort of the central area of the north central region, from Wisconsin, Iowa, South Dakota, and southward to Kansas, in that near average. And then drier conditions again in May for North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wyoming and Colorado as well. So again, contrasting differences between our western states and our eastern states. To do a recap now of our meteorological spring, this March through May period of 2020, despite the chilly temperatures really in April and May over a large portion of this region, temperatures averaged close to or slightly above average, especially above average in the east for Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio, and then also in the far west of our region for Colorado and Wyoming. But in general, this was really a reflection of the warm winter, but more specifically for this period, the warm March that we had. So despite the chillier April and May, we were still about average to above average here for our meteorological spring. About the top 40th warmest in the east, again for states like Ohio and Michigan, but 12th warmest meteorological spring for Colorado. Looking at our precip again, dry west and wet east. A couple of exceptions here, but first of all, the 9th driest for Colorado, North Dakota, below average across the northern Great Plains for sure. So you see those 9th driest states there. You know, dry in the west was initially okay. You know, coming off very saturated conditions that we had 2019 and into the winter, but particularly across the Dakotas. But as time has gone on here, dryness has continued. We've started to build up some heat, skies being, you know, sunny, a lot of wind. So the conditions, the impacts from this dryness are now starting to be felt across much of the region. Top 20 wettest for places like Ohio, Michigan, Missouri as well. Indiana sort of sticks out there in the east. If you look at the March through May recap, sort of missing out on the much of the rainfall. So they're just near average there, states around them surrounding Indiana, a little bit above average. And this is going to play in when you see the updated on the US Drought Monitor a little bit later. So one thing to note certainly is the lack of severe weather across the US, and I've circled our region here, not across the north central region. You know, this is the fewest May severe weather reports since 2014 for the nation, and certainly not a lot of severe events taking place in the month of May. Certainly that's changed now as we've headed, we're well into June here. But including, you know, a lack of severe weather reports from what this is showing you, wind reports and hail and tornado reports as well. Fewest May tornado watches from the Storm Prediction Center going back to 1970 to present. So just indicating there wasn't a lot of severe weather that we typically see in our region during the month of May. A little bit more recent climate conditions, the last 30 days in terms of temperature. This is looking at departure from normal temperature for the last 30 days, well above average, 4 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit across the western states and the northern Great Plains. And we can see that extending from Colorado and up across the Dakotas and into Minnesota. In fact, there's multiple locations across this region that are setting records for the most days already in June of 90 degrees or greater. Some examples, Sioux Falls, Sioux City, just very warm conditions, some of the top 10 warmest for a lot of these areas in central and southern Minnesota as well. And to go along with that, you know, it's been very windy as well. And so the heat and the combination of the heat and wind is certainly playing into our soil moisture and other conditions that we'll see in a moment. It's been above average in the east, Ohio, westward to Illinois and into Missouri, but not as warm compared to average as it has been across the western sections of this region. And to kind of illustrate this is from the Midwest Regional Climate Center, just looking at the daily low temperature records broken or tied during the month of May. So you see a lot of both overnight lows, the low minimums, and the daytime maximums, but in terms of the cold daytime maximums, a lot of records broken throughout the Midwest for cold temperatures in May. And we've really transitioned now into some June heat, a pretty stark switch in conditions where we're seeing a lot of daytime high maximums as well as overnight lows that are in record territory. So just kind of, you know, as an example, this is taking place over a large portion of the north central region, not just the Midwest as it's depicted here, but certainly we've seen that switch from colder conditions to much warmer conditions here in June. As far as precipitation goes for the last 30 days, we've got this is figures showing the amount of rainfall in inches over the last 30 days here. Again, we can pick out this swath of heavier rainfall from Missouri northward through parts of eastern Iowa into Wisconsin. And this was associated, much of this, or a good part of this, associated with Tropical Storm Cristobal, which we'll get to also later in the program today. We've also had a little bit heavier rain in Kentucky up into southern portions of Ohio over the last 30 days. But much of our western states, again, seeing less than 2 inches of rainfall from west central Minnesota back through North Dakota, South Dakota, into Wyoming and Colorado as well. We've got another area of dry conditions concentrated from western Kentucky into portions of Illinois and also Indiana. Again, Indiana kind of sticking out in the eastern states in terms of the dryness that they've seen recently. This is the percent of normal here, again, just kind of showing compared to average. Far east is pretty wet. That track where Cristobal was and additional rain thereafter from Michigan, Wisconsin, back toward Iowa and Missouri, well above average, and then very dry compared to normal here out in our western portion of the area. Now turning to our impacts from our recent conditions here. So we'll start with the soil moisture. And so on the left is our calculated soil moisture ranking percentile using a leaky bucket method. This is from the Climate Prediction Center. In areas where you see green, these are our soil moisture ranking percentiles that are pretty high here, above the 70th or 80th percentile. Again, being able to pick out that path of Cristobal here largely, but also, you know, a little bit heavier here. We've had some persistent cutoff lows in the southeastern U.S., and that's continued to provide some moisture here over southeastern Ohio. But if we look at the anomaly change, or the difference between our June 16th and the end of May here, a lot of our north central region have seen declines in the calculated soil moisture here, particularly over parts of southeastern Kansas, where you know, this was just kind of indicative of very high soil moisture content before, and some big changes over the last couple of weeks here. But not just in the west, but we've seen some declines here in the east as well, from Illinois over into Ohio as well. So, you know, the dryness of spring was initially welcome, but it's come to an end now. And what these soil moisture figures are showing us is that we really need, you know, some good precipitation across the region now. The demand for the water, both because of a growing crop, but also because we've seen the hotter, sunnier days, is really drying out the surface. And so there's some impacts here that are starting to be felt. And certainly we're seeing that in terms of our soil moisture drying out a bit. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. Of course, we can delineate the previous map kind of showing the top meter of the soil column here. If we're just looking at the surface, the top 40 centimeters or so of the surface, you can see a lot of areas close to the surface that are really drying out in response to those hot, windy conditions, from central Minnesota over through the Dakotas, Wyoming, parts of Colorado, and down into Kansas as well. And again, that surface drying that's really accelerating in parts of southern Illinois, much of Indiana, northwest Ohio, and southeast Michigan as well. It's showing up in the topsoil moisture, the percent short to very short, according to the USDA. And looking at these conditions now across, for instance, in the east, from Ohio to Illinois, large increases in that short to very short moisture over the short period of the week here compared to last week, generally increasing across the country, or at least the lower 48, of about 9% here in that short to very short. Again, we're still seeing increases in short to very short across our western states as well, Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado, up into Wyoming and the Dakotas. So generally across the region, we are drying our soils out, and we need some precipitation for many areas here. And a large reason for that, and I've already sort of mentioned it, is just the demand on the water. We've got an index we call the Evaporative Demand Drought Index. We think of it as the thirst of the atmosphere. It's a precursor for water stress, and so it can give us some clues as to where there's a strong demand for that water, whatever water there is. And so if we're looking at things like the 1 month indication, and again, there's some lag time here. This is June 11th. You know, strong indication of drying conditions across the West. Again, lining up with our soil moisture differences compared to average as well. But also in the 1 month, you know, we're looking at areas in the East as well. I think a little bit more clear of the recent changes we see are in the 1 week eddy index here. So rapidly increasing demand due to that dry air, sunny skies, warmer conditions. And so we're seeing some really stark demands here on water. The heat and the very windy conditions are leading to some very intense evaporation rates. Trent Ford, the state climatologist in Illinois, you know, referencing that essentially in the month of June, soils there have generally lost 1 inch to 1.5 inches of moisture in the top 10 inches of the soil column, right? So dry earlier in the spring when temperatures are a little bit cooler, we can handle, but now we've got a growing crop, and then we've got additional heat, sunny skies. We're really drying those surface out quite a bit here. So it's just an example of the demand that we have for the water. All right, so switching gears a little bit here to continue with the hydrologic theme. Certainly, we're looking at above average temperatures across a large expanse of the western snowpack. There's not much left, right? So this is the Missouri River Basin snowpack, generally about 1 inch left. And a couple of things to point out here. If we're looking at the timing and the accumulation, of course, the peak was ahead of the 1981 to 2010 average, both above Fort Peck and also Fort Peck to Garrison here. But the decline and the melt since then has been very rapid, and especially as we got into May and June here. So now that we're, on the 16th of June, we're looking at 58% of normal above Fort Peck, and from Fort Peck to Garrison, about 40% of the average. So above average temperatures leading to rapid snow melt in the Mountain West here, and some early flooding of upstream tributaries that have since come down quite a ways. If we look at the Platte River snowpack, again, melting very quickly. We note the high peaks here in April and May, and then this very rapid decline, which is typical of this year, but it's been even more accelerated than average. So now we're looking at about 25% of average in the North Platte here, and about 4% in the South Platte. So even more melting, extensive melting, rapid melting taking place in the southern branch there. So flows on the tributaries are now generally low, or lower, I should say. And so there's not a lot of concern for widespread flooding from within this basin, for instance. And we can see that also in our 7-day stream flows here, continuing the hydrologic theme here. Stream flows generally falling across the entire region. We can pick out some areas here where we see below average stream flows in parts of Indiana and Ohio in response to the lack of rainfall that we've seen and drying soils. Southern Kansas as well, central Minnesota, and parts of western North Dakota as well that are really showing up on the graph here. A couple of areas still above the 90th percentile from central Missouri northward through Iowa and Wisconsin. Again, with the more recent rainfall, a band of 3 to 6 inches of rain, for instance, from Cristobal in eastern Iowa, and then extending up into Wisconsin, that seems to have been wet for a very long time now, certainly across this region. And so overall, however, outside of those areas that have seen a little bit of the heavier rainfall, stream flows are falling and fairly rapidly in some areas of the region. So if we break down our basins a little bit, we're looking at the Ohio River Valley. Not much here, really, no immediate concerns for flooding. Certainly, we've got falling stream flows across this region. They're dropping. There have been some minor to moderate type of floods locally in response to some heavier rainfall over the last 30 days in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. But it's pretty much, I don't want to say a non-story. Here we've got falling stream levels. We're really not concerned with any flooding, widespread flooding across the Ohio River Valley basin here. Switching over to the upper Mississippi, again, a lot of the flows here peaked last week from some early June rains, but generally they're falling now and should be mostly below flood levels next week, and not likely to really return anytime soon without some successive rainfall over this region. And so again, mostly falling stream flows and river gauges across this region as well. We'll also take a look at the Missouri River Valley here. So again, we're past peak mountain snowmelt. So the peak flow is really behind us now. There could be a second push in the upper Missouri above Fort Peck this week that may come close to some of the flows that were experienced a couple weeks ago. But really, much of the mountainous west, the mountainous areas have experienced their peak snowmelt flows for the winter of 2019 and 2020. And this is really pretty much on schedule. if we're looking at the flood potential in this basin, it's likely to be in the lower third of the basin, episodic to minor moderate floods in the lower third of the basin as we head into June, July, and August. Again, flood potential is pretty normal as drier conditions have really allowed soils to dry out quite a bit across this basin. And finally, we want to take a look at the Great Lakes here in terms of their levels. We know that they've been really high, record level highs here. Lake Superior and Michigan and Huron are slowly climbing and have slowly climbed over the last month. Some of the lower lakes, St. Clair, not lower lakes, but more specifically, more southern lakes like St. Clair and Erie, kind of maintaining their near record levels here. With Ontario dropping a bit and also below the 2019 levels. There have been numerous issues. We've talked about them on these webinars, and we'll have, as Doug mentioned, I'll have some information later about the special water level webinar coming up next week. But navigation problems, with strong currents when high flow pulses move through, certainly a lot of flooding and erosion along the Great Lakes. I keep mentioning the windy conditions. That's really playing havoc on some of the shores around Lake Erie and Lake Michigan, for instance. And then forecasts are really showing levels kind of peaking now in June and July, then falling slightly, but staying near those near record levels in out 6 months or so. So that's what we're expecting to see. So we're likely to see more of the erosion and issues. When tourism is very big around the Great Lakes, obviously, but when we've got beaches that are disappearing, people are taking notice of some of the damages that we're seeing around the Great Lakes. All right, so we can kind of synthesize this all together now, bring it back to the U.S. Drought Monitor. And this is both the U.S. Drought Monitor today and also the 1 month change from last month here. So again, looking at drier conditions emerging across Western Kentucky, Southern Illinois, north and eastward into southeastern Michigan. We've had now persistent dry conditions developing in Minnesota, so we've got some moderate drought conditions there, over the North Dakota, Wyoming, southern Montana, and of course some extreme drought here on the U.S. Drought Monitor in parts of western Kansas and in southern and eastern Colorado. So we can see the changes. A lot of areas where we've increased at least 1 or 2 class degradation in the conditions. And so, if you've got impacts that are starting to happen across the region, we would encourage you to share that with your local experts, with Extension, folks that are part of this webinar, but also the Drought Impact Reporter. So there's a link there to provide impacts of what you're seeing in your region as this area continues to dry out here. So certainly we've got impacts on the agricultural side. So we'll go through those briefly. A couple of nice photos from Mary Knapp in Kansas here, looking at, wheat conditions in western Kansas and not looking too great out there, not a lot of production and healthy looking wheat there. On the eastern side of the state, too much rainfall at times with very soggy soils as well. So just kind of, I think this really captures what we're seeing, the different conditions across the region here. So we can look at the USDA NASS crop progress a little bit. Winter wheat conditions here, primarily good to excellent. We've got some good conditions out there for the most part. Progress is a little behind the 5-year average, about 3% behind the 5-year average here. We've started to harvest the winter wheat across the southern extent of the north central region, and that's a bit behind from Missouri through Illinois and Indiana as well. But again, generally the conditions are pretty good, although departures from last year are a bit behind where nationally from last year, largely because of the drop here that we've seen in the western area. So from western Kansas into Colorado, where some wheat has been abandoned and cannot continue, this is where things have been a little bit more trying in terms of the wheat condition here. As far as the crop progress for corn progress is ahead of the 5-year average. We can see the percent emerged. This is relatively a change brought on by the warmer conditions that are really improving the stands, especially across the eastern portions, the eastern states here. the dry, hot conditions can be good initially, to help promote some root development, driving those roots a little bit deeper, better established stands, but that doesn't last too long. So these dry, hot conditions, certainly we start to see some of the conditions deteriorating, especially Colorado, but up into the Dakotas as well, where we've seen some drop, some declines here in the percent good to excellent condition. So the dryness is good initially, but again, 1 or 2 weeks too long, and we're going to start impacting the corn progress here. Soybean progress is also ahead of the 5-year average. Again, and I didn't mention this for corn, but well behind in North Dakota. This is really a residual of 2019. Hot and dry. Yes, it's been hot and dry, and the surface is dry, but there are fields where there's just too much moisture at depth, and farm machinery is just too difficult to get out there. So some of the production from last year will not be able to be harvested still, even with the drier conditions. But soybeans are faring pretty well too, 72% good to excellent conditions. And this is just a photo courtesy of Pete Boulay from Minnesota here, soybean field near the Twin Cities, looking pretty good in terms of condition in that part of the central region. And finally, looking at pasture and rangeland, again, deteriorating conditions across the West, where conditions have been very dry, from Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, and even into North Dakota. So if we look at change from last week, it's a bit up nationally, but again, poor. I should say the percent of poor to very poor is up from last week. So conditions continue to deteriorate. And much worse than what we saw this time last year as well. So we had some nice photos here looking out into southern Montana, southwest Montana. And the problem here is really no green up on the mid to low level elevation cool season grasses. Hot, dry, and windy weather doesn't really bode well as here either. So when we're talking about feed for livestock and cattle specifically, this is some of the impacts that we're seeing. And that's really stretching, into the hay fields of western South Dakota, due to these dry spring conditions. So 50% quality compared to average here. Similar conditions in western Kansas and Nebraska. So even future cuttings here of hay kind of in jeopardy. We've got reports of some cattle being sold out west and the hauling of water for livestock, for instance, in Colorado. Scattered reports of reduced alfalfa in spots as well. Iowa, South Dakota, some pest pressure just with some ideal conditions across the region. And I know Dennis spent some time last month really talking about specialty crop impacts from the freeze. So we continue to get reports coming in, and this month we had a report, for instance, on the Michigan tart cherry loss of about 65 million pounds compared to over 2019. That's about a $13.2 million production loss. And now combined with the early season heat, it's leading to poor pollination in a lot of the stone fruits and apples, even those that weren't impacted by the freeze. And so there's been a large fruit drop from these combined impacts. So we're continuing to see some of both the freeze events, but combining with this early season heat as well to yield some lower yields or expected yields coming up in even apples and stone fruits, for instance. Some dry areas starting to stress some crops. This is just some pictures here from National Weather Service. Craig Kajal, I think is how you pronounce it, just looking at the corn curling. We know this is a typical response in corn, but some of those poorer soils are starting to really feel the heat, no pun intended, and the wind as well, that's making the conditions worse and really increasing that demand. Now, as far as major events, it's been quite interesting. As I started the presentation at the top, thinking about tropical storms already and derecho. So we'll start with the rare western derecho. So this is information from the Storm Prediction Center. So what is a derecho? I mean, essentially we're talking about convectively or thunderstorm, straight line wind storm. Okay, and they tend to form some really damaging winds. The damaged swaths are generally, of at least 400 miles long and a width of about 60 miles or more. So a long-lived line of thunderstorms that does widespread damage. And we had one of those events on the 6th of June. These are the storm reports for that date. The wind reports, strong wind reports are in blue. There were, this was the most significant wind gusts of 75 miles per hour or greater in a single day here for the Storm Prediction Center. So a lot of widespread damage from Utah all the way up into North Dakota. There was a peak wind gust of 110 miles per hour near Winter Park Ski Area in Grand County, Colorado. Again, just tremendous amount of rainfall. This produced severe weather reports for 12 hours. And this line of thunderstorms tracked north and east about 60 miles per hour. So just widespread damage. For those that are looking a little bit closer at the frequency here of derecho in the United States between 1986 and 2003, these are mostly an eastern U.S. phenomenon. Okay, so that's where they generally occur. We don't see them in this part of the country very often, right? They're really rare, and so that's why we're talking about it today, just a rare western derecho. Of course, we had 3 derechos during this week. We had this one, we had another one move through the Ohio Valley, and of course, if you heard about the one in Philadelphia and New Jersey as well. So 3 derechos in a single week, causing a lot of widespread damage across the country. Of course, I've already mentioned Tropical Storm Cristobal, basically came ashore and moved through the U.S. June 8th through the 10th. A swath of locally heavy rain from Louisiana northward through Missouri, eastern Iowa, and into Wisconsin and Michigan as well. As a matter of fact, in Iowa, Tropical Storm Cristobal is only the 2nd tropical system on record to move through Iowa. The last occurred in 1900. So most of these storms, when they come ashore in the Gulf, they tend to move toward my area, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, if they come this far northward. Rarely do we see them in parts of Iowa and Wisconsin this time around. Of course, that drops a lot of daily precipitation records. These are all the records so far in the month of June, but a lot of these are attributed to Tropical Storm Cristobal as it moved through. Power outages were numerous across the region. We had mudslides reported in Minnesota, fields and flooded fields, across Iowa, and a band of 3 to 6 inches of rainfall there. So kind of really narrow in terms of its impact. You didn't have to go very far east or west, for instance, into western Illinois, where really Cristobal didn't produce much. That derecho, or long-lived line of thunderstorms that came through Ohio, was kind of associated with one of the outer bands of the storm as well as it moved through. And of course, what would be springtime in the Rockies if we didn't see a little bit of snowfall, right? So June 8th, again, associated with the various systems across the north central region, 7 to 8 inches of snowfall in the Laramie Valley. This event broke the daily snowfall record as well as the June monthly snowfall record, both which had been set back in 1974. So a lot of power outages, again, this late season snowstorm, just providing a potpourri of conditions across the north central region. So we're going to turn now and finish out with our outlooks as we're looking forward here. First, we'll start with the INSO status. And basically this plot is showing the INSO, whether that is warm tropical sea surface temperatures or cool or neutral conditions, and that has impacts on the weather here across the United States. We're in these neutral conditions, and the probability of that occurring or continuing throughout the northern hemisphere summer is pretty good here, 60 to 70%, with roughly equal chance of INSO neutral or La Nina beginning in August through October. Now, just to be clear, we're not forecasting La Nina at this time. This is something maybe we'll talk about in future webinars. But generally, the conclusion from this is we've got INSO neutral conditions that are continuing now throughout our summer period. So what does that mean for us? Well, we'll start with the 7-day quantitative precipitation forecast, or the Weather Prediction Center's look at the upcoming 7 days and how much precipitation may fall across the region here. So actual precipitation in any one of these areas is likely to be a little bit more isolated than indicated, right? But we do, we are starting to anticipate some areas of heavier rainfall from parts of Kansas, Nebraska, northwest Missouri, and into Iowa as well. Some of these heavier totals here on an order of 3 to 4 inches of rainfall. Outside of there, given the fact that we've had, these very warm, dry, windy days, the lighter precipitation, for instance, parts of western Kansas, Colorado, up into much of Nebraska and the Dakotas, this is not likely to alleviate any of the drying that we're seeing there, or even, for instance, across northern Indiana, northwest Ohio either, with, this isn't even close to our normal or our average weekly precipitation for this time of the year. So, while this would be very welcome, we need this rainfall for a lot of these regions here. We need some persistent rainfall over the next several weeks to help alleviate or kind of keep at bay those very rapid evaporation rates that we're seeing across the region. If we look at the 8 to 14-day temperature and precipitation probabilities, again, this is from June 25th through July 1st. A large portion of the eastern and southern states of our north central region looking at near average or perhaps a slightly elevated probability of below average temperatures, especially here across the Missouri Valley. This lines up with where there's a slightly higher probability of seeing wetter than average conditions. Outside of this region, just slightly elevated conditions for the eastern sections. But as we head west, again, with those higher probabilities of warmer than average temperatures, we're likely to see near or below average precipitation for these regions as well. So we start getting in those dry soils, and that's really impacting then the near surface air temperatures as well over the next 8 to 14 days. We've got some risks from NOAA here, looking at from Climate Prediction Center. Excessive heat, a slight excessive heat risk here across the Dakotas, certainly the north central plains, with those dry soils and the likelihood of seeing perhaps some extreme heat, excessive heat in this part of our region. On the flip side of that, our southern states, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, perhaps a slightly elevated risk of heavy precipitation for that period as well. So really the pattern isn't changing that much over the next, say, 8 to 14 days, with a little bit better chances of heavier rainfall in the eastern states, a little bit better of chance of excessive heat over the north central region here through the 1st of July. If we look at the new July temperature precipitation probabilities across the entire region, with the lack of INSO signal, we're basically looking at soil moisture conditions, trends, and what our dynamic models are showing us. We're looking at pretty much elevated probabilities of warmer than average conditions, especially over Colorado, parts of western Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, and southern Montana, even across the Dakotas as well. Again, those western states in our region. Elevated, but not as much in our eastern sections in terms of temperatures, probabilities of being above average. Again, kind of tied a little bit with the moisture here and increased probability, slightly elevated probabilities of above average precip across the southern extent of our region. Unfortunately, we see, an elevated probability of even continued drying across southern Montana, Wyoming, and parts of the Dakotas. So we really, I think, expect things to get worse in this part of our region before perhaps getting better, and we'll look at that in just a second. This is the July through September, again, kind of much the same. Equal chances really just kind of over Missouri and parts of Illinois, tied with a little bit slightly elevated probabilities of above average precip in that part of the country as well. As far as temperatures, mostly above average in terms of probabilities, especially the farther west you go. And again, parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, probably even, close to equal chances, but again, these western states likely to be below average in terms of precipitation over the upcoming summer months. So we can look at the drought outlook that was also released today, seasonal drought outlook for the next 3 months here. Generally across the region, conditions will deteriorate before any improvement indicated in some of these areas here, perhaps in September. But we're likely to see, some worsening conditions from Colorado expanding northward into Wyoming, across southern Montana and the western Dakotas. And we'll have to watch other areas too, depending on how much of that rainfall we see over the next couple of weeks. Again, with these surface evaporation rates that have been really high, it's going to take some rainfall to really cut into that a little bit across even the central plains and in parts of the Midwest as well. Of course, with all this, we've got elevated fire danger, high wildland fire danger present currently in southwest Colorado. That's expected to expand throughout much of western Colorado and western Montana during the month of July. Out in western Kansas, although not indicated here, the governor's declared an emergency so that folks can prepare for wildland fire, brush fires there as well. May not really be captured across the northern plains, but with these very windy, hot, dry days, that elevated fire risk is increasing pretty quickly across this region as well. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap things up then. Looking at our summary conditions, we've transitioned from a cooler to a warmer than average state across the north central region. A lot of warm, very windy days across the central and northern plains, and that's brought up the demand for water, really rapidly increased the demand for water. So we've got some really intense evaporation that's occurring across the region, combined with crops that are wanting that moisture as well as roots get deeper, the stands become more established here. So our soils are drying, stream flows are dropping, and we've got some fire danger now that's starting to increase across the west. In the Great Lakes, they're continuing their record or near record levels. As far as agricultural impacts in terms of conditions, row crops, corn and soybean faring well right now, certainly better in a lot of areas compared to 2019. But that dryness is only going to be good for a short, limited amount of time. So precipitation is really needed here as we continue to experience some issues with our pastures and rangeland. Looking at our summary, again, INSO neutral through the summer, then we'll talk about what happens later as we get closer to our fall season. But our summer outlook's basically based on soil moisture and trends. So we're looking at warmer than average conditions, likely across much of the region in July. Greater confidence, again, in the western states, slightly elevated probability of above average precip in the far southern and eastern reaches of the north central region. So drought is likely to expand and intensify across parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and the western Dakotas. And we could have some intense drought in other areas as well, depending on how scattered or isolated the next couple of weeks of rainfall are across our region. So always want to thank our partners across the region, again, National Climate Data Center, Climate Prediction Center, state climatologist. This is a collaborative effort. It's a lot of fun when you get to talk to so many experts across the region and think about the impacts that we're seeing from our recent climate. You can always find today and past recorded presentations at the following links there. Again, special information here, Great Lakes Climate and Water Levels Update and Outlook webinar. Look at high water levels, the climate outlook, some impacts. This is going to happen next Monday, June 22nd. You can register at this link here, and I think Doug mentioned he's going to have some information in the chat as well. So if you're concerned or interested in the Great Lakes water levels, this is a special webinar coming up. So we'll stop there. I'll hand the mic back over to Doug and Dennis, and we will take questions. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, Aaron. That was great. And yeah, you stuck to exactly the time you said you would. I'm sorry, I'm poking fun at Aaron a little bit there, but he had a lot to cover because a lot is happening, right? So if you have any questions, put them into the question. If you anything lingering or you don't understand something, Sue Lowry, your hand has been up. I bet it really hurts, or your arm hurts anyway. I'm gonna unmute you, and if you have something you wanted to ask, please do, or if you just have it up there as a mistake, we'll ignore you. I see you put your hand down. I'll assume that you don't have a question unless you put your hand back up again. So some of the questions that we got, or comments really, were that soil moisture units. One of the questions was what are the units that we measure soil moisture in? And Dennis, I know you answered very specifically to that particular person. Do you want to and I'm sorry I didn't introduce you, Dennis Toddy again, my partner in crime on all these calls from USDA Climate Hub in Ames, Iowa, Midwest. Do you want to go ahead and tell everybody else a little bit more about soil moisture and how it's measured?
Yes, we could go on ad nauseum at great length about how you measure soil moisture, but what we frequently do is create maps that are done in percentiles, basically a ranking scale from 1 to 100. What that gets around is that you can then put the current context into some sort of a ranking scale, middle of the road, very wet, very dry. And it also avoids the issue of different types of soils, because different types of soils hold different amounts of moisture, and then there's different levels of the soil, so it can get really complicated very easily. So basically, it's percentiles. You can rank, you can cut across rankings very easily.
Okay. You know, one thing that we probably could have mentioned, and I'm not sure why we didn't. I know we talked about it on a couple other things that we do in terms of getting information out to the public, but there was significant flooding in central Michigan when a dam broke, and very heavy rains. That was in May, I believe.
We captured it last month, Doug. It was right before last month, so we captured it then.
Yep, you're right. You're right. We did talk about it. Well, the question sort of is, have there been because of that heavy rain, because of the dam break, has there been agricultural impacts that we're aware of that are widespread? How about that? That we know of. I'll just put it that way.
The agricultural impact, the widespread impacts so far, you know, there was probably some things that were planted in that dam break that we had to replant at that point. That area is farther north, so it's not as much of a row crop area. I don't know of any details. Crystal ball coming through, we'd had some.
Whoop, are you there, Dennis?
Plant, or they just will take their insurance payment this year. But most of the wetness issues have gone away, and we're flipping over to watching the dryness at this point.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, there's a general in that the same person sort of asking, is this impacting lake levels, and have there been other impacts? And I'll say just very quickly, the main thing that has impacted lake levels, you know, over the last 2 years is excessive precipitation, maybe a lack of evaporation, yeah, abundant water into the lake system, and actually that's been a trend for a few years, to be honest. Any other comments, Aaron or Dennis? Okay. Also, recently this week, there was a, just in case we're trying to catalog fires, there was a 1,600 acre fire on the Pine Ridge Reservation, started by fireworks this week. Our good friend Brian Fuchs is reporting in Lincoln they're having 60-mile-an-hour winds as we speak. So that's interesting. And then, any concerns with corn, soybeans, and wheat at this time? Boy, that's a really broad question. It's a good question. It's a fair question, but I'm going to I'll let the agriculturalist handle this one. So, Aaron, since it's your presentation, you want to say something first, then Dennis more broadly.
Yeah, I'm sure Dennis will clean up anything that I talk about here. But you know, it obviously it varies widely across the region. Obviously, when we were cold in May, emergence was slow. Things were a bit behind. The heat has really accelerated the growth and accumulated those growing degree days. So that's helped. So if you look at the long-term averages in terms of growing degrees, we're getting close to or at average now after some cold start there. And of course, that doesn't pan out across the entire region, but certainly is true here in the east and parts of the central, north central region. I would say, you know, I think I mentioned that the dryness initially, you know, a lot of farmers welcome that in terms of corn and really driving the soil, the roots a little bit deeper. I've had a couple of reports, even since we've kind of organized the webinar, of, you know, conditions dried out so rapidly that some of the soil is getting a little bit hard for even the roots to get well established. And so that may be something that over the next couple weeks we might hear more reports about that as well. I'll go ahead and shut up now, and I'll let Dennis kind of take it from there.
No, Aaron did a nice job there. I mean, the heat has been somewhat beneficial, pushing along the degree days, like Aaron said. The issues, let me step aside with one issue with winter wheat right now. You know, we've reached a point where the heat is probably doing some more damage to winter wheat than it is corn and beans at this point, because we're still early enough in the season for corn and beans. So we're stressing winter wheat, and we need to cool things down for that. Aaron touched on possibly driving rooting depth deeper, which is good. The more concerning point, and it's more of a regional look right now, is what happens to corn and beans in that north central area, that like Dakotas, western Minnesota, that looks like it's going to be warm and dry ongoing into July. Crops are moving, corn especially is moving along quickly now, that it's going to be reaching tasseling probably in that second week of July timeframe. And if we continue hot, dry conditions to that tasseling period, then we're going to start doing some damage to crops more readily. Soybeans have until August before we start running into issues with them. So we have a bit more time to see what will happen. So wheat's being damaged. Corn is closer to having problems. Soybeans, we still are further down the line.
All right. Yeah, and from South Dakota, we do hear that winter wheat is heading and could suffer from hot and windy conditions this week, and if the heat continues into next week, for sure, especially with that hazardous weather, if you will. Go back to that, showing the heat coming back after this, if you will. This weekend storm system moves through. I'll call it from now through the weekend, is moving through the high plains and central plains, to be honest. There's signs that heat will return, especially above normal. I don't know if you're going to flip it back or not, Aaron, or if you can. Yeah, way back to the hazard outlook. Anyway, so that's what she was talking about there, and Dennis also was talking about that being an issue going on or carrying on into the summer. We certainly don't want to see that kind of stuff continue in that neck of the woods.
Doug,
go ahead.
Doug, let me throw one more quick thing in there. The other thing this is doing for us is we had our problem last year with late planting and then not catching up in degree days all the way through. Seems much less likely at this point that we have delayed development problems this year. So what does grow is going to probably have a better chance of drying down in the fields, it looks like, at this point.
Right, and I don't know if Aaron, I don't remember if you covered this or not, but there has been a definite, in parts of the, we'll say plains, eastern plains especially, there's been a definite increase in winds over the last month to 2 weeks a month or something like that. Well, that causes a lot of problems in terms of putting down various applications of pesticide, herbicides, that kind of thing. And of course, along with that, as Virgil Schmidt comments, complaints too about the drift from that. So it's climate related in the fact that, you know, it's unusually windy, has been unusually windy. I don't know if anybody wants to say any more about that, Dennis or Aaron. Okay. What has been climate, and Aaron did touch on this, is the amount of 90-degree days already in places a little too far north, if you will. So like we were saying, Sioux Falls and Sioux City and other areas seeing a lot of elevated temperatures the first 2 weeks of June. That's the last question and or comment, at least that I have. Stay tuned on the El Nino La Nina angle. That'll become hopefully a little more clear in the next month or two. Excuse me. And I guess we will see you all back, unless there's something else anybody would like to say. Aaron or Dennis, any final words?
Did we touch on the lower dew points, widespread kind of lower dew points that is added to part of the problem of the drying?
Dew points
also?
meaning lack of humidity. Yeah, lack
Yes.
of humidity. Yeah, yeah. I don't know if we
That's a
did.
good point. I did not.
Okay.
Yep.
It's been dry. We'll just
Yes.
add.
Yeah, the air has been dry. The air.
Yes.
That's what we're really talking about here. Unusually.
Correct.
We don't have a study on that per se, but we've all noticed it. So, okay, our next call will be with Martha Shulsky from Nebraska on July 16th. May you get rain where you need it and not where you don't. So thank you very much, and we will talk to you then. Thanks all.